Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Cohen, and I'm here today with a lecture that I'm entitling Sacred Wounds. I'm looking at the intersection of survivor guilt, religious trauma, and the theology of power. The study will focus on these major critical areas and will delve heavily into the theories of trauma and the analysis of power struggles within sexual violence and the aftermath of sexual violence. We'll look in particular at the phenomena of survivor guilt as it's shaped and intensified within a religious context, and how this is a subject that demands our full attention and our intellectual rigor and our moral seriousness. The roadmap for today's discussion will be the 7 points right here. We'll define the topic. We'll look at religious power systems. We'll look at purity theology, shame versus guilt, communal silence, survivor agency, and the reclamation of a narrative. And then we'll wrap it up with a view of justice. And that is our forward process today. Sexual violence is fundamentally an act of power and domination, not an expression of desire. I want to sit with that statement for a moment because it is the foundation on which everything else in this lecture rests. And it's a statement that took decades of feminist scholarship to establish against significant resistance. So the older framework, still present in popular culture and troublingly in religious contexts and communities of some areas around the world, understood sexual violence primarily as a matter of uncontrolled desire. The perpetrator wanted something, and the perpetrator took it. The victim was the unfortunate object of that wanting. This framework is not just wrong, it is actually harmful because it locates the case of violence in a form of desire that can plausibly be displaced onto the victim. If the violence was caused by desire, then the question of who or what provoked that desire becomes relevant and the focus. And we now know where that question leads. I want to look at some scholarship that emerged in the 1970s. One specific author was Susan Brownmiller, Bell Hooks, Catherine McKinnon, and many others. And they started to reframe sexual violence as an exercise of power, that the violence is not incidental to the domination, it is the point. The sexual violence is a means by which social hierarchies are enforced, bodies are claimed, and power is expressed in its most intimate and devastating form. Now, why does this definitional move matter specifically for the study of religious studies or in religious contexts? Because religion is a system of power, and when we understand sexual violence as an exercise of power rather than a failure of desire, the religious context stops being merely a backdrop, it becomes casually significant. The question is no longer, why did this person lose control of their desires in a religious setting? The question becomes, how does religious power enable, legitimate, and shape this form of domination? So I want to look at 4 types I've identified here. And we'll look at these specifically as wartime rape. It's on the screen on the left side, top column, which is religiously motivated assault is the second category. Institutional power cover-up is the third category, left column bottom. And gender-based persecution. These are not 4 separate phenomena. They are 4 expressions of the same underlying dynamic, the use of sexual violence as an instrument of power, with religious frameworks providing legitimization towards that violence. In wartime rape, we will look at a specific historical examples in a moment. Sexual violence is deployed as a weapon against the enemy population. When that war is framed in religious terms, the violence becomes a sacred sanction. We'll look at the Crusades, the partition of India, and maybe even the Bosnian genocide. And in each case, religiously identify was the central to who was targeted and why for that type of violence. Religiously motivated assault in non-wartime context often involves the claim that the violence is itself a form of divine enforcement, so punishment for apostasy, for impurity, for transgression of religious gender norms. Third is the institutional cover-up, which we'll discuss in the section of communal silence, is perhaps the most structurally interesting case because violence is not sanctioned but is actively suppressed after the fact by the same institution within which it occurred. That can be very dangerous in very school settings. And gender-based persecution, the systematic targeting of individuals on the basis of religious gender norms, represents the intersection of patriarchal theology and sexual violence in perhaps its most naked form. All four types share a common feature. Religious frameworks are not simply present when the violence occurs. They are doing work, definitional, legitimating, silencing work. That is what we are here to understand in terms of a religious framework. So religious power systems, Weber and transcendent authority is what we'll look at here on the far right column. To understand how religious contexts create specific conditions for sexual violence and specific conditions for the suffering of survivors, we need to understand the framework for understanding religious power. Max Weber is a good place to start for that. Weber's typology of legitimate authority is one of the most influential analytical tools in the social sciences. He identified three pure types: rational legal authority that is grounded in institutional rules and procedures, the authority of the bureaucrat, the judge, the elected official. When I follow a law, I'm not obeying a person. I'm obeying a system of rules that has been legitimized or legitimated through recognized procedures. Then there's traditional authority. It's grounded in the custom and inheritance, the authority of the patriarch, the monarch, the elder. Its legitimacy comes from the fact that it has always been this way. And there's charismatic authority. It's grounded in the perceived extraordinary qualities of an individual, the prophet, revolutionary, the saint. Real institutions, Weber acknowledged, blend all three types. But religious institutions add something that this typology that Weber does not fully capture. I'm going to call it that transcendent legitimization of a person. It's the claim that authority derives not from human agreement, custom, or the perceived qualities of an individual, but from some sort of divine mandate. So we would look at divine here as the main focus to what we want to find within religion. This is qualitatively different than the three types. It's the law. If the law is unjust, we can change it through recognized procedures. Traditional authority can be questioned by appealing to a higher principle. Charismatic authority can be contested by questioning the leader's actual qualities. But transcendent authority derives from God and is by definition not subject to any challenges. You cannot appeal over the head of divine authority to a higher tribunal. There's no higher tribunal, and transcendent authority then is total authority and total scope in a way that other forms are not. The authority of my employer governs my work behavior. The authority of a state governs my compliance to the law. But the authority of my religious figure, my God, claims jurisdiction over my entire life, my body, my mind, my soul, my destiny, and this is very qualitatively different kind of power. So what does this mean in terms of like survivors of sexual violence within a religious setting? It means that when a perpetrator occupies a position of religious authority, the power differential between them and their victim is not merely institutional, it's cosmic. To resist such a figure is not merely a challenge to challenge your superior. It may be experienced by the victim, by the community, and sometimes explicitly stated as challenging God. And so to report abuse by such a figure is not to just make a complaint. It may be experienced as blasphemy, the betrayal of the community, or the spiritual destruction of that person. So we want to look at the four consequences of transcendent authority. It's non-negotiable. It is non-falsible. It is total in scope. And perhaps most importantly, it enables what James Pulling calls obedience theology, the theological satisfaction of deference to authority as a primary virtue. When obedience to authority is understood as a form of obedience to God, the capacity to refuse becomes not merely difficult, but theologically suspect. The survivor who refuses reports is not exercising appropriate moral agency. They are being disobedient, faithless, rebellious. The theological framework has already been prepositioned to them as the transgressor. This is not an accident. It's a structural feature of how certain expressions of religious authority function. And the context within survivor guilt takes on a particular theological content. So let's look at this idea of purity theology and the body of a person. The second major mechanism by which religious environments create conditions of survivor guilt is what I am looking is what I'm calling the theology of the body, specifically the purity frameworks that regulate the body states in religious traditions. So I want to look at a very basic anthropological observation. There are certain works like Mary Douglas's work on purity and danger, purity and impurity. Douglas argues are not primarily hygienic categories. They are systems of classification. Every culture designates certain things as pure and certain things as impure. And these designations map onto our social and symbolic order of the community. What is impure is what threatens the community's orders and categories. The anomalous, the transgressive, and boundary crossing within the community. And the human body, particularly in religious traditions, is a primary site for the working out of these classifications. Bodily states are spiritually significant. They mark the individual as acceptable or unacceptable, blessed or polluted, inside or outside the community's moral universe. Now, here's where the consequences for survivors become direct. In many religious traditions, and I want to be careful when I say this, many rather than all, because there's a significant variation. Sexual violation, regardless of consent, renders the survivors ritually and morally impure in many communities. The survivor's body has been transgressed. The purity of that body has been compromised, as we see in the purity framework in the left column. This purity framework, notice that it is not primarily about what happened to the survivor, it's about the state of the survivor's body as a result of what happened. The violated body is not innocent, it's contaminated in this framework. And this is the consequence. Look how the question changes. What happened to me? A question that locates the morality relevant action in the perpetrator's behavior becomes, what is wrong with me? A question that locates the moral problem in the survivor's own body. This is not a small shift. This is a theological precondition for self-blame. It's the framework within which a survivor can come to believe with apparent logical coherence that their violation was their own fault. Not because they chose it, but because they were the kind of person to whom this could happen, because their body had been marked as impure, because they are now, in the eyes of their tradition, and perhaps in their own eyes, damaged. I want to be honest about the gender dimension of this analysis. In most of the traditions we are discussing, these purity frameworks apply with particular force to female bodies. Female sexuality is marked especially in the need of regulation in many religious traditions as a source of disorder, temptation, or danger, and must be contained through religious or social structures. This is the power system that starts to develop over. This is not an incidental when female sexuality is understood as inherently problematic, requiring containment. Sexual violence against women can be reinterpreted consciously or unconsciously, and the consequence of a woman's failure to contain herself leads to a feeling of self-blame. The violence becomes, in this perverse logic, what happens when women are sufficiently regulated, calling for their regulation. So I want to be clear, this logic is not only present in extremist or fundamental contexts. It's present in many communities and operates in a much more mainstream religion. It has subtle forms of victim blaming within many traditions. The sermonic emphasis that happens on female modesty as the primary protection against male sexual behavior becomes what is happening. The theological elevation of female purity as a value above female agency is what's happening. So to put that very plainly, the religion is elevating purity above the agency of a human being. The expectation that women's experiences of violation will be mediated and managed by male religious authorities also exacerbates the problem. These are features many contemporary religious communities across traditions are doing, and they feed directly into conditions of survivor guilt. So we call this the purity calculus. The survivor's search for the specific spiritual or moral failure that made them responsible for their life violation is one of the most painful and most theologically structured features of religious contextualized trauma. So we have to understand it in order to address it. This slide contains what I consider the analytical heart of today's lecture, the distinction between shame and guilt. It is well established in clinical psychology. The key research here is Tanguy and Deering's work from 2022, but it's the theological implications that have not been fully worked out in literature. And I want to try to do that right here. So guilt is the focus of a specific action. I did something wrong. This is morally focused emotion. It has a clear referent, a specific transgression. It's a defined scope. And crucially, it is resolvable. Guilt can, in principle, be discharged. And a person is saying, I acknowledge what I did. And if they did something, they know they did it wrong. And they make amends where possible. And they commit to doing differently. And guilt has a trajectory. It moves towards resolution. Shame is fundamentally different. Shame is not focused on action, but the self as a whole. It's saying that I am something wrong, or I am defective, or I am unworthy, or I am contemptible at my core. Shame is no clear referent. It's not about a specific act, but about the totality of what a person is. And because it attacks their identity rather than their behavior, it has no natural trajectory towards resolution. There is no amends that a person can make to be fundamentally shameful. So Tanguy and Deering's research demonstrated empirically what this phenomenon was in their analysis, and suggests that shame is strongly associated with maladaptive outcomes, depression, self-destructive behavior, interpersonal hostility. And paradoxically, shame is associated with the suppression of acknowledgement of wrongdoing, because to acknowledge a wrong is to risk the total judgment of shame. And so it is safer to hide. So by contrast, guilt is the contrast, and particularly what researchers call guilt-prone orientations is associated with more adaptive responses to transgression. It motivates acknowledgement, it motivates repair and change. Now, here's where the theological implication sits. Religious frameworks can engage either with guilt or with shame, and the consequences differ enormously. A religious community that responds to a survivor's disclosure by asking what happened, who was responsible, and how can this be addressed is engaging with the structure of guilt. It is treating the violation as a moral element or a moral event that requires a moral response. This is pastorally responsible. However imperfectly it may be executed. The religious community that responds by focusing on their survivor's contamination, their damaged purity, their compromised spiritual status, is engaging in the structure of shame building. It is treating the violation not as something that is done to the survivor, but as something that the survivor now is. And that can be devastating to the survivor. This is precisely where purity theology becomes the most dangerous. Purity frameworks are shame-inducing. They do not say you did something wrong. They say you are now something wrong. They say you're impure, contaminated, diminished. But shame is also produced by more subtle theological moves. I want to flag explicitly because they appear in relatively mainstream religious contexts. Demand for immediate forgiveness of the perpetrator before the survivor had had the opportunity to name their harm, mourn their loss, and receive acknowledgement is one of the most common. It says your experience of or violation is less important than the spiritual requirements of the community. The deployment of universal sinfulness as a framework, we are all sinners, to neutralize the moral distinction between perpetrator and victim is also another. It is genuinely true theological claim. It is also, in this context, a tool for suppression of accountability and the erasure of a survivor's specific injury. So what I'm calling survivor's guilt in a religious context is more precisely a complex theological symptom, a synthesis of psychological defense mechanisms and internalized religious norms. Its content is not merely, I should have prevented this. It is, I am the kind of person to whom this happens. God's punishing me, and I have brought shame on my family, my community, and my tradition. So this is why ordinary therapeutic approaches, cognitive behavioral techniques that challenge irrational beliefs, are often insufficient for survivors of religious settings. The beliefs are not held merely as personal convictions. They're held as articles of theological commitment, backed by their tradition, their scripture, and their community. You can't argue someone out of a theological framework. Effective support for that survivor requires engagement at the theological level, not just the psychological one. I'm going to look at Herman's trauma framework. Judith Herman's Trauma Recovery was published in 1992. It remains the essential framework for understanding the psychology of sexual violence. I want to talk through 5 of her key concepts and show each one maps onto religious context. The first is the shattering of trust. Herman identifies the disruption of basic trust as central to traumatic experiences. When the person or institution you trusted becomes a source of violation, the very foundations of your ability to engage with the world are damaged. And in religious settings, the trust that is shattered is invested in a public figure understood as a representative of the divine. This is not merely interpersonal betrayal. It is, in a very real sense, cosmological. The God who was supposed to protect you was represented by the person who harmed you. Walking through the betrayal requires not just psychological work, but theological work. Second is the disruption of a just world. Most people operate with the psychologists call just world assumption, the belief that bad things don't happen to good people without reason, and trauma shatters this. In religious settings, the shattering is particularly accurate because religion provides the most elaborate available frameworks for explaining suffering. The survivor is caught in what I call false theodicy. It's the attempt to restore the just world assumption by accepting responsibility for their own violation. God allowed this to happen, therefore I must have deserved it. The theological framework produces self-blame as a form of cognitive self-preservation. The third concept is testimony and witnessing. Herman argues that the recovery requires the survivor to narrate their experience before a witnessing community, to tell the truth about what happened and have it acknowledged. This is a therapeutic and moral claim. Testimony serves not only the survivor's healing, but the community's acknowledgement of what has been done. In religious settings, the conditions require the testimony to be precisely those that religious institutions frequently destroy. They'll push people out. We will discuss this maybe more later. The fourth is what Herman calls complex trauma. Trauma that occurs within an ongoing relationship of dependency, the concentration camp, the domestic abuse situation, the cult, all contexts from which religious victims cannot easily escape because the relationship provides essential needs. Religious communities are precisely such contexts. They provide identity, meaning, material support, emotional sustenance. A survivor in such a community cannot simply leave the relationship without catastrophic loss of self. This is why the question, why didn't you just leave to a cult member, is inadequate. It fails to account for the total relationship embedding of the religious community. And the fifth is the perpetrator strategies. Herman identifies the mechanisms by which abusers maintain control with striking clarity: normalization, isolation, and undermining of the victim's reality. In religious settings, each of these strategies requires theological expression. Normalization becomes doctrinal. Suffering is redemptive. The flesh is weak. Forgiveness is required. Isolation is reinforced by communal boundaries that pathologize suffering as betrayal. And the undermining of the victim's reality happens, arguably the most psychologically devastating strategy. That becomes sustained and appeals to divine order of the victim through this experience. So, are you sure that's what happened? God will not allow that. So and so is a good member of the faith community. Or questions that are asked to people who are abused and therefore cause undermining of trust. We've talked about how religious frameworks create conditions of vulnerability and how they shape the psychological and theological aftermath of the violation. Now I want to turn to the community, to the people who knew or could have known and said nothing. The suppression of survivor testimony in religious settings is not accidental. It's structural and it operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. The most visible is explicit silencing, where direct threats institutions are given to not to speak to people, demands for confidentiality. This is what make the headlines. The bishop who told the supervisor not to go to the police, the elder who threatened expulsion, This is real. These are serious problems that happen, but it is in some ways the least interesting mechanism analytically because it's the most obviously wrong. More interestingly is the communal pressure, the subtle, the diffuse message that disclosure will be treated as betrayal. You'll not be told directly to be silent, but you'll watch how the community responds when others speak. You'll hear their murmurs about loyalty and faithfulness, and observe who will be elevated and marginalized, and you'll understand without being told that your belonging is conditional on your silence. This is how institutional culture suppress testimony without anyone needing to give an explicit instruction. And then there's what I call theological neutralization, the use of religious language to efface the moral distinction between perpetrator and victim. We were all sinners. Forgiveness is not optional. Judge not lest you be judged. These are genuine theological claims that are deployed in the context of survivor disclosure and the mechanisms for suppression of accountability. And the theology becomes a tool in the service of institutional protection. Judith Herman describes what she calls as the second wounding. It's the discovery by survivors that the institution was aware of the harm and chose to protect itself rather than help. It's not just the knowledge that you were harmed, it's the knowledge that your harm was known and that people in a position of authority made deliberate choices to prioritize the institutional reputation over the safety of the person. And this is, in many survivors' experiences, devastating. And even more devastating than the original. It confirms that the perpetrator of violence and their behavior is that you're not worth protecting by the institution. I want to say that bystanders, people who are suspected wrongdoing of others or knew and remain silent, religious traditions have strong resources for thinking about bystander responsibility. And there are many traditions within the Hebrew tradition and the Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition that have commanded you to do good and forbid evil. And so we should be becoming more supportive and mandating our reporting. The survivor agency. Everything so far in our discussion is with the impression that survivors are religiously contextualized with sexual violence, are passive victims, and objects acted upon by violence and institutional failure. And I want to push back on that impression if that's what's coming across, because it's both empirically wrong and ethically problematic. Survivors are agents. They think, they choose, they resist, they create. And crucially for our purposes, they theologize. Survivors of religious violence fundamentally engage in intense, ongoing theological reflection, interrogating the framework imposed upon them, challenging those frameworks, revising them, and sometimes rejecting them outright. This theological work is not incidental to recovery. It's often central to recovery. And the first form of agency is what I call resistant reading. This is the practice of deliberately interpreting sacred texts and traditions in a way that contradict the norms that burdened the survivor. So Phyllis Trible's Text of Terror is a scholarly formation that of something many survivors do intuitively. She reads 4 biblical narratives of violated women against the grain of their traditional interpretations, recovering their voices, experiences of those interpretations that have been suppressed. And when a survivor sits with a text that has been used to silence them and finds them, it instead of a witness to their experience is an act of theological resistance. The second form is what Serene Jones calls of a reformed theology of grace. Core Christian categories, sin, redemption, grace, and resurrection, can be read as instruments of harm or resources of healing. When a survivor reinterprets resurrection not as a pious abstraction, but as the embodied experience of surviving what could have destroyed you, that is genuine theological work. The tradition is not simply the problem, it is also potentially a part of the solution, but only when the categories are read through the lens of survivor's experience rather than imposed on top of it. So, I want to say something about the choice between staying and leaving for a victim, because this is a question that comes up often and is frequently misunderstood. Survivors who choose to remain within the faith tradition that was the site of their harm are not in denial. They are not simply failing to take care of themselves. For many survivors, their tradition is not merely an institution they attend, it's the fabric of their identity, their community, their sense of ultimate meaning. Leaving would be leaving, not mean just leaving a church, it would be leaving themselves. And the choice to remain and engage critically and on their own terms is the expression of agency, not their absence of agency. So equally, the choice to leave is not only not always an act of rejection. Survivors who leave a tradition often continue to engage with it theologically, through critique, through recovery, through suppressed elements, through the construction of alternate communities. We have to push towards restorative justice. As we move towards this conclusion, we want to turn to the question of justice. What does justice look like within the context of religiously contextualized sexual violence? What do religious traditions owe survivors? What would it actually mean for a community of faith to respond adequately? Religious traditions tend to prefer restorative rather than retributive approaches for wrongdoing. Rather than punishment, the emphasis is on repair, the acknowledgement of harm, the restoration of right, relationship, the reintegration of all parties into the community. There is much that is genuinely valuable in that framework, but I want to flag 3 specific risks when we do restorative frameworks and apply them to sexual violence without careful thought. First, the pressure of premature forgiveness. Forgiveness is a genuine theological value in many traditions, but forgiveness that is demanded before the survivors had the opportunity to name their own harm, mourn their loss, receive acknowledgement isn't forgiveness. It is suppression. It serves the community's desires for resolution rather than the survivor's genuine need for healing. The timing and the initiative for forgiveness must come from the survivor, not the institution. Second, the reintegration of the offender. Restorative frameworks rightfully attend to the humanity and potential rehabilitation of those who have done wrong. But when reintegration of the perpetrator is treated as a goal on the same level as protection and healing of the survivor is again put at risk. These are not symmetrical concerns. Third, the prioritization of communal wholeness. The desire to restore the community to peace and unity is understandable, but when the desire overrides the ongoing, often disruptive, often uncomfortable process of genuine accountability, it produces suppression. So what does genuine accountability require? I want to be very specific. It requires acknowledgement of the specific harm, not the vague institutional apology, but a clear naming of what happened, who is responsible, and the community's role in enabling and suppressing it. It requires honest examination of structural conditions, what made the harm possible. It requires transparency via institutional knowledge. What made it known? When was it known? What we've done with this knowledge? This kind of accountability is rare. It's costly. It requires willingness to prioritize trust and justice over institutional reputation. If justice, protection of the vulnerable, and truth-telling are genuine religious values, and every tradition I'm aware of says they are and claims them, then suppression of survivor testimony, protection of the institutional reputation at the cost of the survivor, and the deployment of forgiveness as a tool of silencing are not merely failures of pastoral care, they are theological betrayals. I'd like to thank you today for being a part of this lecture, and I look forward to future times to which we can discuss more deep theological questions. Have a good day.